Okay.
Okay. Now,
Do you have a migraine?
and I've got this recording.
Like our
So-
voices and stuff.
So don't say anything stupid.
Okay. So, the first thing is this. What are the components of paint?
Pigment and vehicle.
Binder.
Good. Pigment, vehicle, and binder. Now, one of the things that you are going to have to consider is, well, if it's pigment, vehicle, and binder, then what is the binder for watercolor?
No, that's
Arabic?
the
Gum Arabic. What is gum Arabic?
Is it a rock?
some sort of plant byproduct, right?
It looks like a rock.
It is the sap of the acacia tree,
It's not a rock.
hardened, okay? Then it is taken and ground into a powder, all right? And that powder looks like this,
Nice.
okay? Now, that's the binder. You need pigment. Medieval painters typically had a limited palette, and this was because they were restricted to what they had available to them, okay? So, whenever you're painting in the medieval style, you will often limit your palette to a specific selection of colors, okay? Now, with that said, that's with the colors. Let's talk about black and white, okay? Standard pigments for black and white. Standard for black is bone black. Bone black is very specific bones from a chicken that have been carbonized, so burned, and then ground into a fine powder, and it produces this. This is bone black, okay?
It looks like charcoal.
It is an extremely dense black, and it's a really good black to use. White. Prior to the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, there was really only one way you got white. Lead.
Wait, is that lead?
This is lead white, okay? And it is produced, now to produce it in a significant quantity, what they would do is they had specially designed ceramic jars, okay, that kind of had a certain breathability to them. And they were designed in a certain way so that the centers kind of went down and then they was slightly raised up. And they would take a lead bar or cone and sit it in the middle of that. Then they would pour urine into that jar up to a point, not touching the lead, okay?
I'm sorry, what?
Up to a point, urine. And then they would seal the jar and then pack it with dung.
Okay.
This would produce a highly acidic environment.
Yeah.
And after not too long, they would open it up and they would pull the lead out. And that lead would be coated in what's called lead rust, and it's typically white. Okay? Have you ever seen an old really like old fishing kits that have like the lead weights, but you notice that there's kind of a white powdery stuff on the lead.
Mhm.
That's lead white. Okay? Lead white looks like that, yes.
Who thought that was a good idea to try?
We have to understand, for much of human history, I mean, lead was not considered
Oh no,
poisonous.
not the lead part, the urine and the dung part.
To increase the acidity. So this is pure lead powder.
Oh,
That
it's
sounds
like,
dangerous.
This is lead white.
it's like,
Okay.
It's chalky.
Now there's another type of lead, red lead, known as minium. And minium is kind of neat. For one, this is the color of minium.
Oh,
Okay.
it's orange.
Yeah. Medieval illuminators would often lay out certain things in minium. And one of those things would usually be an enlarged letter with kind of decoration in it, right? And the word for that is a miniature. And it comes from the term minium, because they would lay those out that way. And it was like a miniature scene inside the letter and everything like that. So that's this is where we get the term miniature.
Did they make that the same way as the white?
There's a similar process.
Okay. How did they get that color?
It's the nature of the lead and its additives.
Oh, okay.
So
Um,
they add something to it to make it change colors?
It may not be like a pure lead. It may have a certain mixture to it. Others. So when you look at other pigments, you'll run into things like Italian yellow earth. Where's it come from?
Italy?
And what is it?
Dirt.
Dirt. That's right. Okay? There's also other fun ones. Are you familiar with hematite? You know what hematite is? Pass something around here. So, what you see here on this necklace,
Oh. Yeah, I know what that is.
this is hematite right here. This is lapis lazuli. Okay? So I'm going to pass that around. But hematite can be ground into a powder, and depending on the type of hematite you have really kind of two options. So this is regular hematite. Okay? And this is violet hematite.
That's pretty.
Okay?
I like that color.
Now, not all pigments are mineral based, but of them, the most valuable. Yes,
So the hematite is black. So
but
how
when
does it turn
ground
red?
into a fine powder,
Is it just the
its
inside?
color can shift. Yep.
Okay.
Cool.
That's good.
One of the most expensive is lapis lazuli.
Mhm.
For much of human history, throughout Europe and Asia, it was the only source of blue. It's where we get the term ultramarine blue. It's from across the sea. Lapis only comes from a certain area in Afghanistan. Now there is another source for lapis. It's Chilean lapis. But Chilean lapis does look different than Afghani lapis, okay? There's also another form of blue known as Mayan blue, which for a long time they didn't know what the formula was because it actually has multiple components. Some of those components actually came from Florida. So really, historically speaking, there's three sources of blue. Now, that said, the main source for much of human history was Afghani lapis. It was extremely expensive. It still is. This is 3/4 of 1 ounce of lazurite, lapis lazuli.
How much is that?
already processed. 1 ounce is around $80. Okay?
So that's right there is almost 80.
Now, when processed, it produces, like when mixed with its binder and everything, it produces this. You can pass this around. Okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead and pass a couple other things around. This is bone black. Now you notice I have these in shells, okay? The reason is because medieval painters, particularly medieval monks, used seashells for their paint. So,
Awesome.
and this is lead white.
That's
This is
Now, this, that's old. I'll hold off on that.
Before like this gets like super dry like this, is it like more white looking or?
Yeah. Well, and there's a reason why it's not a pure white. Okay, so you have your pigment, gum arabic. Okay, which if you want, you can, this is safe. You can, so if you want, you can pass that around. Now, you can theoretically use the sap of any fruit tree. The acacia tree works best. That's why gum arabic is the most popular. But in theory, you can use the sap of any fruit tree. Why?
Repeat that again.
You can use as a binder the sap of any fruit tree to make a watercolor paint. Why?
And it's natural or has water in it?
There's more to it than that. Why? Notice I said a fruit tree. Didn't say a pine tree. Didn't
Do they
say.
have more sap than other trees?
It's not necessarily that. It's that it contains sugar.
Oh.
And that is what makes the binder somewhat adhesive.
So would the
Okay.
binder be sweet?
Yes.
Interesting.
But the acacia tree makes the best, okay, in terms of a binder. Now, with that said, the thing of it is, when you talk about medieval illuminators, they were making books and pages. Now, this poses an issue because once dried, what happens? What can happen to the paint?
Yes.
It can crack. So in order to paint onto parchment, where the pages can be turned, they had to add one more thing. Honey. Honey adds elasticity to the paint. Pending the amount you add, it can also generate an increased gloss. Okay?
Cool.
So all you need to make paint is a pigment, some binder. If you need a little more elasticity, some honey. And that's it.
What about the vehicle?
The vehicle is water.
Right.
So, let's make some paint. Now, making paint is really not a very complicated process. Let's see if I have a fresh shell. It's okay if I don't. Okay. All right. So, now, anytime you work with original materials that may contain lead or anything like that, you always want to make sure that you keep the brushes that you use for this separate. Okay, that's vitally important, and part of it's because while medieval monks would take a brush, and in order to get a fine point out of it, they would twizzle it in their mouth. Now, the problem with that is, of course, is what's in the fibers of the brush that from their work? Lead. So, one of the things you want to make sure of is that you keep those brushes separate. Now, that happens. When you just pile them in like that, that does occur. Now, I need somebody to do me a favor.
Sure.
I need water in this. Actually, I need water in that and something else in there.